There is no other game franchise quite like Yakuza. The original game was made in 2005, and for the last 15 years, Ryuga Gotoku Studio has been pumping out games at a pace which would make even the Assassin's Creed developers blush. The series has been picking up steam since the release of the PS4 prequel game Yakuza 0, which has been greatly assisted by Sega deciding to branch out and release the game on PC and Xbox, as well as the PlayStation platforms. The mainline games in the franchise have all been announced for those platforms, but there are also several spin-offs like the police-focused Judgment, the zombie game Yakuza Dead Souls, and even an entire line of samurai spin-offs set in feudal Japan, the latter of which have never been released outside of Japan itself. The latest release is the most solid effort to make a game marketable in the West since the original PS2 game, which is the only other release in the series to have an English dub. On that note, if you're a fan of the series, how crazy is it to think that Marc Hamill originally played Majima?
Ow! I should kill you. Stupid! Fucking Bolivar!
The curveball with this one is that Yakuza Like a Dragon is also the first game in the series, spin-offs included, to be a turn-based JRPG rather than a real-time action game. The combat in previous Yakuza games felt similar to Virtua Fighter or Shenmue, and when I heard that Yakuza 7 was going to be ditching the series' signature combat for a turn-based system, I was actually pretty let down. Flash forward to the end of 2020 when I got a chance to play the Western release of Ryuga Gotoku 7, titled as Yakuza Like a Dragon here, and I was pleasantly surprised to find that the game still very much feels like Yakuza. Also, if the titles have been throwing you off, here's the deal. The studio which makes the games is called Ryuga Gotoku Studio, and the name of the series in Japan is Ryuga Gotoku, which translates to Like a Dragon. Sega apparently thought that calling the game Yakuza 7 in the West would discourage new players from jumping in, so they elected to make the subtitle of the new game the translation of the Japanese title. Kinda similar to the subtitle of Resident Evil 7 being Biohazard. So Yakuza Like a Dragon is the 8th, game in the mainline series because 0 counts, but luckily for potential new players, that doesn't really matter. While there are references to past series events and familiar faces for fans of the series to run into, the majority of the game involves a brand new story about brand new characters, including a new lead protagonist. So if you've always been intrigued by the series but have no idea where to start, the 2 points which I'd personally recommend are Yakuza 0, which is the earliest game in the timeline and is available on Game Pass, or the game we're here to talk about today, Yakuza Like a Dragon. Like a Dragon begins with the somewhat disconnected opening prologue showing us a stage play about a geisha in the 1960s, but it introduces us to Masami Arakawa, a young boy who would eventually grow up to become the patriarch of the Arakawa Yakuza family. After some groundwork for future storytelling is laid, we jump to 2001 and are given control of the new hero of the series, Ichiban Kasuga. If Ryuga Gotoku Studio should be commended for one thing, it's that they managed to make Ichiban incredibly likable within 20 minutes of meeting him. We pick up with Ichi as he's working collections for the Arakawa family and has to collect a payment from a big dude working construction. This functions as a bit of a combat tutorial and ends with a bit of a twist, as Ichi takes all of the money out of the wallet he and his partner retrieve, gives the money back to the construction worker, and takes the empty wallet to satisfy his mission. Ichiban then explains that he knows the guy they were collecting from, and that the only reason he's even in town working construction on New Year's Eve is because his mother is sick and he only took a loan from the Yakuza in the first place in order to pay her hospital bill. This introduction sequence, combined with the great facial animations and stellar voice work, got me on board with Ichiban early, and throughout the entire game he is consistently proving himself as a worthy successor to previous series protagonist Kazuma Kiryu. Kiryu is a dark, stoic badass, and Ichiban is a wide-eyed, happy optimist, but both manage to function very well as heroes. The easiest way to compare them is to think of Kiryu as Batman and Ichiban as Spider-Man. One isn't exactly better than the other definitively. They are different personalities and are both great in their own ways. At the end of the opening chapter, Ichiban demonstrates his integrity and commitment by offering to take the blame for a murder in order to protect a high-profile member of the Arakawa family. The story then picks up 18 years later, with Ichi having spent that entire time in prison. Without going into too much detail, the newly freed Ichiban finds himself being betrayed by his former patriarch, shot in the chest and left for dead, and it's here that the main story really begins. Ichiban wakes up in a homeless camp, having had his wound tended to by a former nurse named Nanba, and then begins trying to put the pieces together of why he was betrayed and why the Arakawa family split from the Tojo clan and joined their rival Yakuza faction, the Omi Alliance. Ichiban consistently references that his moral compass and inherent desire to be a hero stems from his years playing Dragon Quest, which ties the thematic justification into the shift to turn-based combat. The idea is that in Ichiban's mind, everything is occurring the way it would in a JRPG. He's forming a party, gaining experience to become stronger, taking time to help out NPCs by doing side quests, learning new skills and attacks, and like any good JRPG, making his way through a compelling story. The effectiveness with which Yakuza Like a Dragon executes these concepts is a tad hit or miss at times, but especially when you consider that this is the first turn-based RPG Ryuga Gotoku Studio has ever made, the combat is surprisingly solid. Like a Dragon uses an interesting mix of a straight turn system with some real-time elements mixed in. You aren't given a time limit in which to select your moves or anything like that, but as you stall, enemies and your party members will pace around the battlefield. This helps the game avoid criticisms many fans of real-time combat have with turn-based systems, as while you and the enemies effectively do wait around to get hit when they aren't attacking, they at least seem like they're participating in the fight by moving around. The pacing isn't only superficial either, as positioning does come into play for a few reasons. First, some area of effect attacks have specific arcs and will only hit enemies caught in the attack zone. Second, the environment can give you opportunities to do extra damage, such as picking up a bicycle or a traffic cone to use as a weapon for a higher damage attack, or kicking some debris at the enemy on your way to an attack for a bit of initial bonus damage. Finally, it affects which enemies you should select to attack with which character, because if you have to run by another enemy to attack your intended target, they will attack you en route, not only doing damage to that character, but forfeiting that character's turn entirely. Positioning doesn't make the combat overly complicated though, as it's mostly out of your hands. This isn't a tactics RPG, nor does it factor into positioning to the degree that the Trails series does, as you can't aim attacks specifically, nor can you move without attacking. While this does limit the tactical flexibility, it also keeps it simple and lets you focus on the basics, like when to use which attack or skill on which target. The two other real-time elements in the combat involve guarding and damage enhancement quick-time events. Pressing B at the moment your characters are about to take damage activates a perfect guard, which significantly decreases the amount of damage taken. So you're never waiting around to get hit entirely, as you can always mitigate the damage you're suffering by staying engaged and timing your blocks. Most of the standard skill attacks will give you a timed prompt of either hitting the Y button at a specific moment, tapping the X button repeatedly, or both, which when successful give your attacks a pretty significant damage boost. There are also several attacks and abilities which unlock over time which have elaborate, lengthy animations and do not involve any button prompts, and thankfully these animations are skippable. They're very flashy and extremely cool to watch a few times, but they're also so effective and their MP cost is so reasonable that you'll find yourself using them very often. And during some of the late game grinds, this could have added hours of needless padding to the playtime. Hitting the start button lets you skip the animation, which funny enough makes these super skills take less time than the standard skills, so they'll be your best friends during chapters 12 and 15, where the difficulty spikes by about 10 levels each. The other attacks which involve elaborate, lengthy animations are the summons, which Ichiban can activate by using his phone to call a service called Poundmates. That service is not as sexy as it sounds, but it is as funny as it sounds. You can even summon Jordan Peterson to clean the enemy's room.
Stand straight with your shoulders back, bucko.
It's also worth noting that there are an incredible number of potential skills, as in addition to having 6 main party characters and apparently an optional one which I missed, each character can be assigned jobs which change the majority of their skill sets. These jobs rank up independently of the character level, which has the downside of making you really want to specialize into one job per character, rather than branching out and trying all sorts of different styles. The upside is that if you ever feel like going through the game a second time, you can completely change your playstyle, as even if you use the exact same characters in your 4-person party, you can change their jobs and give them totally different movesets. There is also a system which lets you tag characters in and out, but I found this was at odds with the character bond system, as the inactive characters don't level up evenly alongside your primaries. So I found myself with a very strong lineup using Ichiban, Adachi, Sayako, and Namba, which left the other 2 characters on the sidelines for most of the game. And as for Eri, I dropped the ball and missed her entirely. I didn't spend much time doing the confectionery management minigame. Apparently I should have. Ultimately, the combat is very serviceable, entertaining, and is deep enough for JRPG fans to dive in if they wish, but it's also simple enough that players who don't have experience with JRPGs won't end up feeling totally overwhelmed. The challenge is pretty reasonable for the most part, and the pacing remained pretty stable outside of a few instances, but sadly the aforementioned difficulty spikes do rear their head in the later chapters. The downside to this is that after chapter 12 you'll find yourself needing to take a break from the main story and start grinding, although this is also around the time that the 30-stage battle arena pops up, and if you keep replaying floors 26 to 30, you can count on getting a level up with each run. So the climb to level 50 for chapter 13 and the climb to level 60 for chapter 15 aren't quite as annoying as they could have been, but it might be a bit of a system shock if you're not accustomed to JRPGs and we're just gunning through the campaign for the story. When you're not in battle or the middle of a story event, your time will primarily be spent walking around the streets of Ijincho, engaging in Yakuza's signature amount of side content. There are tons of side quests to stumble across, and for the most part they're very funny, with you doing things like helping people solve their problems by eating incredibly spicy kimchi, or drinking some baby formula with a bunch of diaper fetishists. There are also full-blown minigames like the aforementioned business management or the engaging Dragon Cart mode. You can interact with these side activities as much or as little as you'd like, but in addition to being small, amusing pieces of content, they also offer significant rewards which will help you progress through the main story. One of the activities, the Hero for Hire service that you moonlight for, known as Part-Time Hero, is a very fast way to earn both money and experience, so if you find yourself needing to save up for items and gear, tracking these down is a good bet. One of the other activities is tied into the character bond system which I mentioned earlier, and that one involves having drinks with the boys. Or with Sayako, but Sayako is effectively one of the boys. I was constantly forgetting to do this, but whenever you bring a character's bond to its level lock point, you should go to Survive Bar and have a drink with them. This not only gives you one piece of their multi-phase side story each time, but it helps you unlock more potential job roles, skills, and lets them gain more XP when they're not in the active party. All of these systems come together to give Yakuza Like a Dragon an incredible amount of gameplay to explore outside of the main story, but that doesn't mean that they drop the ball on the narrative. Yakuza Like a Dragon likely has the best main story of any game I've played this year. Cyberpunk had incredible side stories, Half-Life Alyx had a gut-punching conclusion, and Trails to Azure was riveting, but even it required the benefit of 4 prior games worth of lore to feel the full weight of. Yakuza Like a Dragon almost falls into this same trap, and I certainly felt more weight in chapters 12 and 14 due to having played Yakuza 0 and the 2 Kiwami games, but even removing the moments those memories provided context for, the story which Like a Dragon tells is incredible. Ryuga Gotoku Studio is adept at presenting characters which seem absolutely despicable, having you dislike or even hate them for vast stretches of the game, but as the story unfolds, nearly all of them are given development and context, which makes them much more relatable and sympathetic, even if they aren't ultimately redeemable. This is greatly aided by the fact that Ichiban apparently comes from the Luke Skywalker school of not wanting to give up on his loved ones regardless of what they've done, rather than using the Jake Skywalker, my nephew is having a bad dream and therefore he must die method. I went over the first 2 chapters in detail at the beginning of the review, and if I were to try to dive into all of the remaining chapters, this video would approach Mauler runtimes, but without giving too much away, I'll say that the story has a lot of moving parts and more than a few major twists, but it remains a compelling crime drama from start to finish. If you asked me a month ago, I'd probably tell you that I'd never even consider playing a Yakuza game in English, but the English dub in Like a Dragon is truly amazing. Not only are the English actors fantastic, with Kaji Tang's Ichiban and George Takei's Arakawa being notable standouts, but the dub syncs up with the lips almost perfectly.
You see why I can't let Joe get arrested for this. Ichi, would you be willing to take his place?
Are you serious, boss? I mean, I've been waiting for a shot like this. This is my chance to finally repay my debt to you, after everything you've done for me. Let him lock me up for 10 or even 20 years. I'd be happy to do it for you.
Ichi.
If I didn't know better, I'd even guess that this game was primarily made in English, but the truth is that they just took the time to change the lip sync animations. To contrast, Ghost of Tsushima's Japanese dub looks ridiculous because the game was recorded in English and Sucker Punch did not change the lip animations, so playing Ghost in Japanese just looks incredibly silly. Yakuza Like a Dragon can be played in English or Japanese, and either way, it looks really good and will keep you immersed in the story. Outside of the voice work, the rest of the sound design isn't overly impressive. Nothing is particularly bad, and most of the music in the game is actually quite solid, but the majority of the sound effects are carried over from other games in the series. The result is that everything from punches to the menu sounds are very canned and simple sounding, though I suppose it does work quite well considering the life as a video game motif. The visuals, on the other hand, are incredibly solid. Beyond the aforementioned facial animations, the Dragon engine is really coming into its own. The lighting and reflections in this game are particularly stunning, and the 3000 series graphics cards are finally hefty enough to run this engine at 4K with a reasonably consistent 60 frames a second. I've read that the game also has 3 separate performance settings on Xbox Series X, which will presumably be carried over to the upcoming PlayStation 5 version as well, so if you're on a next-gen console, you'll certainly be able to play the game at 60 frames a second. The Xbox One and PS4 versions are stuck at 30 FPS sadly, but the turn-based combat makes this less of a big deal, although I imagine it could make timing the perfect guards a bit more difficult. The game even has a very functional first-person mode, which gives you a good look at the environments, and it looks incredibly impressive in the chapters that find you in Kamurocho at night. Ultimately, if you do decide to give Yakuza Like a Dragon a shot, regardless of the platform you choose to play it on or the language you choose to play it in, you'll be treated to a solid 60 hours of gameplay, which will take you through an incredible story with a lot of heart. Also, I'm 100% certain that everyone who voted for The Last of Us Part 2's Best Narrative Award just didn't play this game. There's no comparison at all. Just try watching the ending scene of Yakuza Like a Dragon without tearing up. It cannot be done.